You're listening to episode 155 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Today we speak with yoga instructor Julian Marc Walker about his online book, Devil in the Details: 3 Keys to Thinking More Clearly About Spirituality. Secular Buddhism is, in many ways, suspended between two worldviews, that of the naturalistic and non-religious, and that of the faithful and religious. We often find ourselves brokering discussions between these very different poles, caught in the middle as we explore Buddhism's teachings and practice, couched in ancient tradition, with contemporary understanding of the world informed by science. This is also true of other disciplines like yoga, which is also undergoing a Protestant revolution. New ways of seeing the world seem to clash with ancient attempts to understand. We often get mired in discriminating attitudes rather than collaborative investigations about how our predecessors in practice may have been trying to understand what they were discovering. Julian Walker has been teaching yoga since 1994 and practicing mind-body healing since 1997. He studied under Anna Forrest from 1992 to 1998 and was certified by her to teach. Influenced by American Buddhism, Tantra, and transpersonal psychology, Julian has led workshops across the United States and in Canada, and has been training teachers and body workers since 2001 and sharing his twice-a-year transformation retreats to Ojai since 2002. He weaves sacred poetry, world music, mythology, and transformational themes into his deep stretch and flow yoga classes, and is well known for his Funky Friday class that includes ecstatic dance. So sit back, relax, and have a nice Darjeeling. And our guest today is Julian Walker. Julian, thanks for being here.
Hi, Ted.
So what we're going to be talking about is the book that you put out called Devil in the Details: 3 Keys to Thinking More Clearly About Spirituality. And we've had some really good online discussions about this, and I'll want us to dive into that. But before we do, I'd ask you to share with the listeners a bit about your background.
Okay. Well, I'd be glad to. Let's see. I'm originally from South Africa. And
you don't sound like it.
I know. I've been here for about 20 years. And unlike most immigrants, I didn't spend all my time hanging out with other South Africans. So I've acclimated. And I've been talking to people for a living in every job I've had. And I think I just fairly quickly decided changing the way I said certain words would be better than having to repeat myself. I also, part of the story for me is being a white kid from South Africa. I was deeply conflicted about growing up in that culture, and always knew from a young age that at some point I would leave. Helped in no small part by the fact that there was a draft to support the apartheid regime, and so when the time came and I left, I was very psychologically prepared to enter another stage of my life.
So what was it when you knew you were growing up and you knew, you weren't going to stick around here? Was there a particular draw to come to the U.S., and what did you want to investigate when you came here?
The draw was very much freedom, democracy. I was absolutely captivated by the 60s. I think that what South Africa was going through in the 80s is very similar to what was happening in the US in the 60s. There was a war happening in another country. Uh, Kids were being drafted to go and fight that war. There was internal uprising happening. There was a whole cultural expression of that was going on through theater and literature and poetry and music, a very vibrant countercultural art scene happening. So the experience I was having in South Africa in the 80s looked a lot to me like the American 60s. And I really idealized this country for its freedom. Yeah, in a country where 80% of the people did not have the vote, America looked really good.
Yeah. Yeah. So tell us about your upbringing that led you to have some understanding about contemplative practices and your yoga practice as well.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about that. I'm glad you're asking. Thank you. I have the this sort of prototypical intellectual hippie parents who had kids very young and who were in opposition to the apartheid government and had a fantastic bookshelf. So I grew up confronting the questions of what it meant to live in a society that was profoundly unjust, confronting what it meant to, I suppose, to think about what mattered in life. And in a way, there have been times when I've bemoaned that fate of having to think about such things at an early age. But in a way, I think it woke me up early on to really taking these sorts of questions seriously. And at the same time, my parents were interested in psychology and spirituality. Houston Smith's uh, seminal book on comparative religion was on the shelf. There was the Beat Poets were on the shelf. I was looking at Alan Watts at an early age. So all of that really had a profound influence on me. And being that I identified with the 60s in the way that I did, I also experimented with psychedelics in my late teens. So I was on my own quest to understand freedom, I suppose, both on an external and an internal level. And I came to the US in the late 80s, early 90s, went to music school in Los Angeles, and during that period just got really involved in having a daily meditation practice, got a book out of the library on yoga, started getting into working with my body in that way because music school was difficult, hunched over a music stand holding a guitar 7, 8 hours a day. So I needed to do something for my body. And I started and just never stopped.
Now, did you find an early resonance with your meditative practice and yoga?
The yoga for me was very much about tending to my body. I was incredibly stiff. I had lived a fairly toxic life in terms of my diet and the intoxicants I had put in my body.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and I was honestly holding on to a lot of angst and a lot of emotional tension. And so the yoga practice right away from me was about getting physical relief, but also about spending time feeling my body and being somewhat surprised by the emotions that would surface. The meditation practice at that time for me was very much about finding a kind of island in the storm, finding some sort of place of relaxation and calm and being able to face the fact that I was in a country where I didn't know anyone and go through this stressful music school training. So it was more the kind of soothing meditation practice at the time, and served me wonderfully.
Was there a particular place that you did the meditation with a group, or was there a particular practice that you did as part of your meditation?
Both the meditation and the yoga for me in the beginning were by myself in my bedroom on the floor. You know, I would find different books, and at this time I got really into Joseph Campbell. I got really into Alan Watts. It was a very personal thing. I didn't know anyone else who was even interested in such matters.
In California, no less, which has the
Yeah,
highest listenership of any state to this podcast.
it's true. I don't think a lot of them were at the Musicians Institute in Hollywood at the time.
Have you kept up with the music at all? I'm curious about that. If you started that as at such a key point in your life.
Music is my first love, and it went through different phases. But I would say around about the time that I started being moderately successful in my yoga career, that started to be the outlet for my creative energies. Between, my yoga classes are very eclectic. I bring in a lot of poetry. I bring in a lot of themes from psychology and mythology. I love DJing the class and creating an experience for people, and that became the outlet that I think the playing of music and the writing of songs had served in the past.
So you had
Yeah,
a chance to have a creative expression in addition to a regular yoga teaching scenario.
exactly. Exactly. For me, it's very much about creating an experience for people and activating as many levels, if you will, as possible. So feeding the mind, tending to the body, making space for the emotional process, having it be inspiring and uplifting, but also a safe space within which people can plumb the depths of their psyches if necessary.
Uh-huh. Now, I expect in those journeys and in that development, in that story, you would have encountered uh, certain views or practices, either in yoga or meditation, or the people that you might have engaged with, that some were, I think, probably very grounded and in alignment with your own particular approach to things, and still be inspiring and look towards our culture as sources of inspiration. And others might have been a little different, shall we say. So
Mhm.
let's talk a little bit about that. What are some of the things that led to the way in which you understand your practices?
Mm. Well, I would have to say, with as much humility as I can, that whatever perspectives I've come to now in my attempt to experience and share a rational spirituality that's congruent with science, that's psychologically informed, I come by all of it extremely honestly in terms of being a real typical New Age seeker in my early 20s, who was open to all manner of possibilities in terms of paranormal beliefs and the typical gamut of ideas about psychic powers and reincarnation and out of body experience. I was seeking all of that and seeking breakthrough enlightenment experiences that I thought would make my life complete and solve the various problems and anxieties that I had. So over time, I think I realized more and more that for myself, the the more perhaps ungrounded, to use your word, spiritual ideas and pursuits over time started to look to me more and more like a way of avoiding my pain, of avoiding my suffering, my emotional vulnerability, and just sort of being able to be with myself. And so a lot of that started to fall away. And the critical thinking and rational inquiry and the respect for evidence started to reassert itself. I definitely went through a period, like a lot of people I know, where I thought that being spiritual meant that you had to put aside critical thinking, reason, evidence, that all of that was the ego. And all of that was something that would make you closed-minded. And really the idea was to just be in your heart and be open to anything and have faith. And there's no such thing as truth. And over time, I feel like I started to see through that. Yeah.
So as you were starting to see through this and the resonance with critical thinking
Mhm.
and having assertions and taking them in and asking to be shown how those work, that started to gel for you a little more, and I'm presuming that that led to you thinking about writing the book devil in the details. Tell a little bit about that. What prompted you to put the book together?
Well, the book is a very recent occurrence. I just put it out there last year, and so in between where we just left off, as it was all starting to transition for me, I would say in my mid to late 20s. Um, I've had just my own ongoing path of studying and practicing and being a teacher and a healer. I do something I call open sky body work, which is a hands-on modality that's very influenced by somatic psychology. I've been in pursuit of integration. I think the underlying question for me has been, is there a way to have a meaningful, um, spiritually engaged life that is congruent with science and psychology and is really about seeing spirituality as a way to cut through self-delusion. And to me, that was really my entry point. I took a little detour through the New Age stuff, but really what spoke to me first were people like Alan Watts and Charlotte Joko Beck, and a really sort of bare bones, stripped down notion of meditation as a way of working with your own awareness and observing what shows up, and observing the tendency to want to cling to various defenses or thought patterns that might necessarily be true or be very skillful. Yeah, and I think I understand the resistance. I think as human beings, I can certainly relate to this. There's a way that we want to feel consoled. We want to feel comforted. We want to feel that we belong to a community of people who share certain beliefs, and perhaps even at the outer range of that, we want to feel like we belong to a chosen group or a group who knows some special secret about the nature of life and that perhaps other people don't know. And that can be a very compelling need.
That is exactly the wording I was thinking of it as you were describing it, is that is completely innocent,
Yeah,
completely understanding, very compelling. We're social creatures. Totally get that. Doesn't mean it's necessarily how the world works.
absolutely. Absolutely. So looking at it in that way, it started to seem to me that there were two kinds of spirituality. There was a kind of spirituality that was about developing tools and resources in order to be able to confront our existential fears and be more aware of these underlying needs and that are often unconscious and how they drive our thought processes and our beliefs and indeed our actions in the world on the one hand. And on the other hand, there seems to me to be a kind of spirituality that's about perpetuating a lot of beliefs without any kind of inquiry into whether or not they happen to be true, they happen to have consequences that are beneficial, and whether or not they're driven by some underlying unconscious needs that perhaps it might be good to become more conscious about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very comprehensive and insightful way to look at it. And what we often ask in questions when we're working with practitioners who have a strong inclination towards a particular belief is not so much whether it's true or not, but how does this help you? What does this do for your practice? How does this benefit self and others in a meaningful way? And asking that question, perhaps when you're asked a question, you tend to need to think about an answer, and that in itself opens a line of inquiry to yourself. And it may be that it's, I don't need to. I like the tone that it sets for my practice when I bow or chant or light incense or whatever it is. And
Yeah,
that's perfectly legitimate.
yeah,
That's fine.
yeah, 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 absolutely. For me, over time, as I learned more, for example, about neuroscience, I started to conceive of so many of the aspects of both yoga practice and meditation, and I've also been involved in practices like ecstatic dance, and I do hands-on massage and body work with people. All of it has a kind of ritual underpinning. It's all about entering dedicated spaces and engaging in very specific activities with a particular intention, and whatever props and sort of ritual observances bring us into those particular brain states to allow us to then have the experience that we're cultivating through the practice, I think are fantastic and valid. Been curious about how how to make distinctions between those aspects of practice and communal experience and deep contemplative experience and the more supernatural interpretations that a lot of times people think are the inevitable, are inevitably sort of intertwined with practice space.
Yeah, and there's an association, a guilt by association
Yeah.
sometimes with meditative communities with mysticism,
Yes.
and that's not always so, and it is for
Yeah.
many, yes,
Yeah.
granted, but not always so.
Well, the thing that I found problematic about that is that, on the one hand, it means that people who are well rooted in critical thinking and respect for evidence, for example, will then look at all of spirituality and say, well, that's got to all be complete nonsense.
Right, right, right.
Because it's all based in this sort of woo-woo set of beliefs that are pure faith and that avoid critical thinking at all costs. But that's on the one hand. On the other hand, I think it perpetuates this idea amongst people who are naturally interested in spirituality that the two have to go together.
Right, and we see both of those aversions to having a reason and experience and science or evidence based practice, one that is informed by what does the science tell us about what's really going on, and how, again, the same question we ask people who have a particular belief is, how does the science help us with our practice? How does this help move us forward for our overall community? How does this move us as a society forward?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk about the book a bit.
Yes. Yes.
You have in there that, and part of the introduction to the book is that spirituality is often the domain of fuzzy logic and vague beliefs. And I
Yeah.
think that's a thread that you and I have engaged in recently in Facebook, is some active participation and I think very good questioning around some definitions. And one that was coming up in a particular thread was around metaphor.
Ah.
And we were seeing that metaphor was being applied to really have a meaning that I'm thinking of Inigo Montoya saying that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. Where metaphor was being used as reference in the broadest sense. Like, no, metaphor means something else. And so sure, we can really wildly reinterpret words to inaccuracy and to vagueness. And I was wondering if you could speak for just a few minutes about your thoughts around the need for clarity when we're talking about various subjects that are already somewhat elusive.
Yeah, it's the heart of the matter in some ways, isn't it? And it's one of the reasons why I love Joseph Campbell's work for so long, is that and one of the reasons why I love using poetry in my own work is that the language of metaphor is so powerful. It's so evocative. It communicates a kind of emotional resonance, if you will, unlike anything else. And yet, if we're not cognizant of the difference between literal language and metaphorical language, I think we get into a lot of trouble. And again, I feel like people either fall into one of two camps very often, that either, again, all of that stuff is just nonsensical. What do you mean this with these metaphorical notions and these mythic images? And on the other hand, people who just say, well, it's all true. Because it feels good to me, or because conveys something that gives me a sense of the profound or the numinous, therefore it must be literally true. And that's a distinction that it's baffled me for many years it's such a stumbling block. I feel like it's deeply important and yet tricky. And I've looked at different ways of thinking about it. Jean Piaget talks about stages of cognitive development and how there's a stage of development we go through around 11 or 12 years old where we start to learn how to think in symbolic and metaphorical ways. And he observed that this is going back to the 40s when he did his research, that something like 60% of the population in industrialized first world societies still had not fully grasped that stage.
Yeah. Yeah, we're still back to very literal readings of texts that are metaphor.
Yeah, so when we live in a country like the USA, where a significant percentage of the electorate believe in the literal interpretation of the Bible, are opposed to all manner of scientific realities.
Yeah, that the Earth is only 6,000 years old. All forms of life were created in a single week. Kinds of things, and a lot of times the justification still goes back to Pascal's wager of, well, just in case, you should believe in this because you go to hell if you don't. Of course, assumes a particular worldview is true and has absolutely no value as providing substantiation for the claims. So it's always a little tricky. And I know the reference in the discussion we were on was around synesthesia, where your senses are a little mixed up, the wiring is off. Mm-hmm. And it was saying, oh, well, there's my evidence that metaphor, all of our existence and our sensory input is just metaphor. I'm like, no, that's a biological thing. It's called synesthesia. I'm sorry, you're misusing metaphor. That's not. If we're using a different term, that's fine. But let's make sure we understand. And I think that's one of the early conversations we need to have in engagements with others is, let's define our terms first to make sure we're using the same language when we speak, because often we're using different terms, but they may have very similar meanings. And I think some of that was, you've had some discussions on chakras, for example, that skeptic would groan and clutch their temple and say, oh, not chakras again. And yet,
cross to bear. You see, this is my cross to bear, that I'm so interested in integrating these different fields and information from these different areas, not to sound too grandiose, but and so the really dyed in the wool spiritual people just think I'm this rational asshole who fascist who doesn't think anything's real unless science can prove it.
Yeah.
And of course, the more intellectual, postmodern, educated people of that stripe come at me with all of that postmodern and idealist philosophy, Hegel and you can't really say, and it's all just reductive materialism, and how dare you, and call yourself spiritual, And then on the other side, I cultivate all these relationships with people who have a more rational, science-informed worldview, and they go, "What do you mean chakras?"
Yeah, yeah.
Bullshit. So that again, being very influenced by people like Joseph Campbell, my sense is that there are wonderful symbols within spiritual traditions that speak to something experiential that is innate to what it is to be human, and that's been with us for a long time. It's just part of what the human nervous system and brain does. And you can talk about it using different jargon. You can talk about it using different kinds of symbology. But ultimately, for me, it comes down to an experience. And I use the chakras as a way of exploring embodied awareness, and being very influenced by somatic psychology, psychology that's informed by neuroscience, and that's informed by an understanding of the nervous system and how trauma affects the nervous system, and in turn, how that is related to the ways we internalize physical tension. the chakras are this really elegant way of mapping that stuff out and inviting people to explore different areas of the body and possible feelings that may be held in different areas. Not to make too literal a set of correspondences, but it's a really effective way of getting into that material.
You know, it's very challenging when you're talking with a more science-based audience, and even if you set aside the references like chakras, because again, different languages, they're just not resonating with that. When we say just to be able to focus on different areas of the body, to invite our attention and explore what's going on, and here's how that's valuable, we're only just in the very, very early stages of trying to grapple with that from a scientific standpoint.
Absolutely.
And
Yes.
so when we say, oh, there aren't, 500 studies with over 10,000 participants, therefore it's bogus. Well, we need to start somewhere. We understand that we don't have everything done yet today, but there are some promising areas of study, and not in the way that it's promising for us to study the validity of things that have been very handily debunked by grade schoolers like healing touch. And that's, frankly, we're not going to go over that again because that's been debunked. We can very clearly just put a board in front of two people and you're done with that one. So it doesn't mean promising area of inquiry because we're being expected to disprove something.
Absolutely.
But we do need to maintain an open mind with things that we haven't really investigated thoroughly with a set of scientific goggles on.
Yeah, and I think that there's a range of experiences that are possible through breath, through movement, through yoga, through sitting still and coming into a heightened awareness of your sensations as you do in Vipassana meditation. There's a range of truly mind-blowing, life-enriching, heart-opening, wild experiences that are available. I've always been fascinated by those experiences, and I've pursued them, and I've enjoyed them, and I've been cracked open by them, and I've made a career out of sharing them with others. For me, that's constrained at this point within a worldview that says there most likely are natural explanations for that full range of experiences. Just like there are natural explanations for the more pathological set of experiences that are possible, from schizophrenia to bipolar mania to temporal lobe epilepsy, various kinds of hallucinations. It's what our organism is capable of is pretty vast and deep.
And pretty amazing. And that's the thing, is that to have these experiences and to investigate them, it's not a bad thing. That doesn't change that we have them. It doesn't change that they can be wonderfully inspiring and positively beneficial and transformative to us.
Yes. Yeah, and for me, that's some of where I try to meet people who are more on the spiritual side of the spectrum, is to say to them, I am like you. I have been captivated by these experiences and the desire to understand them. And I've pushed into them probably as deeply as anyone I know, if you include psychedelics and holotropic breath work and meditation retreats and extremely deep body work and really pushing those edges. In some ways, I was kind of masochistic and really trying to break through. And yet, the more diligently I stayed with that process and pursued that inquiry, the more I came to the perspective I have now. And I'm sure that perspective will go through its own changes in the coming decades. But I have a feeling I'm not going to revert to supernatural interpretations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have that same sense for my own trajectory, is that once you have seen the man behind the curtain,
yes,
it's very hard to close the curtain again.
Absolutely.
So the book itself, you have 3 keys to thinking more clearly about spirituality, and I want to stress for folks who are listening to this who are more spiritually inclined in even towards the metaphysical, understand even the title there, this is not a disparagement of that practice. This is ways to approach it in a different way than you may have before. It's not taking it down. If anything, I think it's a building up of spirituality. So, Julian, why don't you talk a little bit about that, the keys and thinking clearly about spirituality, how that actually helps it.
I'm glad it sounds that way to you, Ted. Thank you. Yeah, so the book came about because I started to observe. I'm very active online. I blog in several different places on Elephant Journal, and I'm involved in a blog called Yoga Brains and Intent Blog and a few different places. And I've gotten into many online discussions over the years. And I started to notice again and again that there were some fairly predictable arguments that kept surfacing that as I looked into philosophy more and learned about logic, I started to see, well, there are three logical fallacies that show up again and again, and I started jokingly referring to them with my friends as the diabolical trinity.
The antithesis of the triple gem is the diabolical trinity.
Exactly, and that this diabolical trinity is sort of an interlocking set of ideas that I just saw again and again and again in any attempt to make a case for supernaturalism. And what I mean by supernaturalism, paranormal powers, mind-body dualism, the notion of an immaterial soul, anything of that nature. And I'm aware, of course, there may be people who are listening who are sympathetic to those kinds of ideas, beliefs. In the book, I'm proposing that we can be informed by critical thinking and by logical reasoning and by scientific evidence in such a way that we continue to evolve spirituality into a place that I think of as being perhaps more mature or more grounded, more integrated. And so it's a little book. It's just a 30-page book, and it has an introduction and a conclusion. And then I talk about these three fallacies in the body of the text. And the one we start with is called the God of the Gaps, which I'm sure many people are very familiar with. And the God of the Gaps is really this observation that throughout human history, whenever there has been something we have not been able to understand or explain, whenever there's been a gap in our understanding, we've inserted some kind of supernatural agency. So, why does my kid have the flu? Well, it must be that the lady who looks kind of funny, lives down the street, cast a spell on him. Why is that person running through the streets acting crazy? Well, it must be that they're possessed by demons. These are natural human tendencies. It's the way our minds intuitively interpret things. Why were the crops not particularly good this season? It must be that we didn't sacrifice enough goats, because the earth goddess requires blood sacrifice in order to make the crops grow. So what's happened, of course, over time, as we've learned more about the world we live in, as we've learned more about nature and the cosmos, and especially since the advent of science, is we keep filling in those gaps. And so as we fill in the gaps where before we had inserted supernatural explanations with natural explanations, there's less and less for these supernatural agents and propositions to do. And so I think that understanding that, seeing the history of this tendency is helpful when we're tempted to say, for example, well, we don't know what happened before the Big Bang, or we don't know what dark matter is, or we don't know exactly what the relationship is between the brain and consciousness. Therefore, a supernatural explanation is plausible.
Right. And what we're seeing that take place in many Buddhist circles, and this is a nod to my friend Matt Lowry, who's been on the podcast many times, who blogs as the Skeptical Teacher, is Buddha of the Gaps, that he uses. And I'm going to throw out another one there because we're seeing this a lot as well, is quantum of the gaps.
Yes, absolutely.
And this is a favorite of Deepak Chopra's, who does not have a degree in physics, is my understanding, is to insert something we don't really understand well. Very few people do. And that's now the new latest thing we can't really get a handle on that we use in our attempts to understand. And again, our attempts to understand is perfectly reasonable and very innocent and understandable.
Absolutely.
But that doesn't mean that because we don't have the full explanation of everything that all of science is wrong. It doesn't mean because we don't understand it, therefore my particular assertion must be correct because it's been crafted in such a way that it explains all of these things. And it may be, but you just got to show it. That's all.
Absolutely, absolutely. So with quantum physics, very often in the communities that I move in, the yoga world and sort of extended spiritual community, that's the trump card, is quantum physics. Well, what you seem not to understand is that quantum physics has refuted all of science, and quantum physics has shown that thought creates reality because it's the observer.
The observer effect, which is completely misunderstood and misused in that context.
Yeah, and so therefore the secret is true, and you're just closed-minded, and in fact you think you're scientific, but you're really behind the times because quantum physics has shown that reductive materialism to be completely false.
Yeah, and it's science. Therefore, you can't argue with me using science because I just use science. Well, you've misused pseudoscience and a lack of understanding, and again, completely innocent. No one can know everything, and it's very hard to keep tabs on all of the latest developments, which is why this is an ongoing learning process, why it is an ongoing exploration of how things work. And that's okay. It's all right for us to not know.
That's right. And that's why I think really approaching people with the attitude that of wanting to suggest to them that maintaining critical thinking and having this basic attitude of inquiry and curiosity about evidence, and is that really so, that this is the foundation, that once that has been generally sort of accepted, then it's much easier to move forward, because a lot of this very well-meaning and innocent and kind of starry-eyed desire to find some magical, mysterious explanation for reality, it's understandable, and yet it can be matured through this basic attitude of critical thinking.
Yeah. So, logical fallacy number one, God of the gaps.
Yeah. So I move on to the second one, which is the argument from ignorance, and a lot of people might know that the God of the gaps is a variation on the argument from ignorance, but I start with the God of the gaps because it's a convenient way in, seeing as spirituality and the supernatural. And so the argument from ignorance is just that there's a few different variations on it, but the one I come across most of the time is, I have this anecdotal example in my life, and you can't explain it. Therefore, my supernatural explanation is true. How? Because what else could it be, right? So, for example, someone might say to you, every time the phone rings, although this one doesn't work anymore now that we all have caller ID and cell phone. 10 or 20 years ago, people would say, I know who's going to be on the other end of the line. And today, Ted called, and before I picked up the phone, I knew there was going to be Ted. And I said, it was Ted. How else do you explain that except through some kind of psychic ability that I have? Or I went to see this astrologer, and they said things to me about my life that no one else could ever possibly have known. Which generally the person saying this hasn't heard about cold reading.
Yeah. Yes. And I am going to recommend a book, and I'll link to it on this episode page, The Hard Facts on Cold Reading, which discusses its seminal work on how this stuff works. And I'll relay another story again. This is one of Matt Lowry's about a woman who came up to him after a talk that he gave at one of the conferences we attend. And she said, well, I just have to share. There was this thing that happened, and I was at breakfast with my son. He's a little boy, and I thought he's going to want cornflakes. And he said, Mommy, can I have cornflakes just a few moments later? And how can you explain that?
Uh-huh.
And Matt said, well, was it breakfast time? Yes. What does he have most of the week? Cornflakes.
Yeah.
Okay, so could you understand that if you'd thought your son says to you, I want to get a golden lasso that lets people only tell the truth like Wonder Woman's at breakfast time, and then he said that would be a little more compelling and a little more interesting. Or if he wanted ham loaf for breakfast, and you thought he was going to ask for ham loaf, that might be a little bit out of the range of normal experience, and we wanted to do some further investigation there. But for a kid to ask for a breakfast cereal that he has for breakfast at breakfast time, maybe that's just coincidence.
Yeah. 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 It seems to me that our intuitive capacity, our sort of common sense intuitions about randomness and statistical probabilities are generally not that good. So the number of coincidences that are going to happen within the vast array of intersecting lines of causality that are happening in our lives all the time, there's bound to be all sorts of coincidences that are actually much more spooky seeming than I knew my kid wanted cornflakes.
Yeah. Yeah.
That still doesn't amount to evidence that there is some kind of hidden underlying metaphysical pattern to these things happening. And I think that the cold reading and the capacity that people have to really observe another person's body language, facial expressions, tone of voice, all the little tells that we use to give away how we feel and what's true and what's false. It can make actually for a very unfortunate situation, as with sometimes when you see mediums who do these big group experiences where they claim to be communicating with the other side, and people in the audience will be taken in by their act where they feel like they've really reached someone who is dead, and it is so emotional for them. And on the one hand, you can look at that and say, well, what harm is there in that? They're getting to go through a cathartic process and to feel some sense of peace and resolution, perhaps around an issue they had with someone who's died. And yet there's something that is really uncomfortable for me about the dishonesty and about making money on the claim that you have some sort of access to supernatural knowledge or experience that really I don't think we have adequate evidence for.
Yeah, it's an unethical practice, and I will just reference people to a South Park episode. It's about a particular medium who claims to speak to the dead. And I'll leave it at that. Just watch that episode because they do a very nice job of exposing what some of the tricks that are used for that are, as do Penn and Teller in their series Bullshit.
Yes. Yeah, South Park is always a go-to debunk.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've got God of the Gaps.
Yeah.
And we've got Argument from Ignorance. What do we have for number 3?
I start off number 3 with a story, really saying, imagine you're at a dinner party, and one of the guests at the dinner party says, I can levitate.
Well, that's easily. I would love to see that. That would be great.
Most everyone at the dinner party goes, wow, that's fantastic. Sort of a hushed silence falls over the table. And perhaps you're the person who says, really, you can levitate? And you ask the obvious question, well, can you show me? And the answer comes back, well, no, I can't do it here. I can only do it in a dark room by myself. And so, to which you might reply, well, gee, I don't know that I can believe that. Have you ever considered that maybe you're just lying on the bed getting really relaxed and going into a sort of state halfway between waking and sleeping, and you feel like you're rising up off of the bed when really you're just lying there. And if we were there and we could see you, if we put an infrared camera in the room, we'd see you, that you probably were just lying there. And the response that and this surprises me in topics of this nature, how frequently people will say, well, you can't prove that she's not levitating.
Yeah. Yep.
And so, really, we just don't know. So we have to stay open-minded.
And that's not what open-mindedness is.
Bravo. Yeah. Yeah. So this one is called shifting the burden of proof. And we shift the burden of proof when we say the onus is on you to prove that I am not descended from unicorns, or that I am not able to perform some paranormal feat, when really it's the person making the extraordinary claim who needs to provide evidence in order for us to take them seriously.
Yeah, and as Carl Sagan had famously stated, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Exactly. So if the host of the dinner party had said, "I make a prize-winning lasagna. We didn't get to eat it tonight, but maybe another time," you might go, "Oh well, maybe you do make a prize-winning
Yeah,
lasagna."
that'd be great. I'd love to be over for dinner for that.
Maybe someone else would say, "I have this amazingly intelligent dog, and I've trained them to bring me the newspaper when I come home." That's not something that we would necessarily find. That we wouldn't have a raised eyebrow about it. We go, well, that's possible, and I'd love to see that sometime. Uh, what I think very often is overlooked is that if this person really could levitate, and if we really could provide evidence that this was true, it would be the biggest news ever.
Right. It would be awesome. I'd love that.
And I think often this desire to be open-minded loses contact with what it would really mean in the world we live in if these things actually were true. That it's a massive shift in everything we know about the nature of reality. For example, with levitation, it would be everything we know about gravity, the human body, the power of the mind. This would be huge. And so there's this. I think, in a way, I'm pointing out this sort of blasé attitude that comes with saying, well, anything is possible, and you can't prove it's not so, and so maybe it is so. And in fact, this is not open-mindedness. The open-minded person says, I am open to your evidence.
Right. Yes, exactly.
And I don't have to go through my entire life being open to absolutely anything anyone says, as if all assertions are equally possible. This sort of comes back to the principle of Occam's razor, that the proposition that has the greatest number of unevidenced assumptions is least likely to be true. And when you look at two different assertions about reality, we're not just looking at the two of them in a vacuum, that actually we have everything we do know, everything we do have evidence for, constrains our opinions about what we don't know and about what is more or less plausible.
Yeah, and that's one of the challenges that I face with drawing a conclusion that is one that we cannot demonstrate. Because at that point, when we draw that conclusion, we stop searching for the actual answers.
So all of this, for me, it's about logic, it's about reasoning, it's about evidence, and having our spiritual inquiry be informed by these very valuable things. And then it's also about something else. And all of this, of course, is very charged. These are tricky subjects to talk to people about. I've been tarred and feathered on occasion, called all manner of mean things. There and perhaps none is more charged than what I'm about to say, which is that I feel like there's a psychological piece underneath all of this, and it has to do with our existential situation. It has to do with the reality of our brains that can remember the past quite vividly and that can project into the future quite imaginatively, and that are able to hold the abstract conception of death, that one day I will die. And also that are able that this brain is able to construct a sense of self that has continuity through time, even though the body changes and our experiences change. And um, all of this puts us in a particular existential pickle. And I'm not the first person to say this, but for me, meditation, yoga, inquiry into this whole realm of human experience can really be a fantastic way of making friends with our existential situation and at learning how to deal with resiliency and tolerance and perhaps in a skillful and graceful way with really what I think are just the existential facts of life. One of the things that's deeply frustrating about trying to bring this more rational lens to spirituality is that a lot of people just don't care.
Yes, I've found that too. You're absolutely right.
And I think and of course it's always tricky to psychoanalyze people, so I try to be cautious about it. But what I observe, one of the theories I have is that one of the reasons a lot of people who are drawn to spirituality don't care or disconnect, tune out when you start to bring in reason and evidence, is that there's an underlying awareness that if you let this stuff in and you start to be more cognizant of reason and evidence, then there's a psychological, emotional, existential dread that one has to face. And for me, that's where the gold is. You know, that's it. That's it. Okay, good. Now we're there. Now sit with that fear and sit with that sobriety of knowing that you will die one day, and so your actions really matter, and loving people really matters. How you contribute to the world, and unfolding yourself in a way that feels um, like it's infused with integrity and self-actualization. That these things matter precisely because of the facts of life, and precisely because tragedy can strike anyone, and that there really are victims in the world, and that there are all sorts of things that are beyond our control, from genetics to natural disasters to living in under oppressive dictatorships, as I kind of did as a kid. And because these things are real, because you can't explain them away with metaphysics, spirituality actually becomes deeply substantive and important.
I think that's a very good point, that regardless of what our beliefs, our expectations, our assertions are about these claims, whether it's an afterlife claim or a metaphysical claim or a pseudoscientific claim, what we do know for sure right now today is that the actions we take and the things we say and what we do with one another do impact each other in this world, in this life.
Absolutely.
So, Julian, I want us to take a step over to the right, over to lighter topics,
Okay.
and share for a bit the work that you do with yoga, and we'll talk a little bit about your site and some of the things that you offer there.
Great, great. So I have a website called julianwalkeryoga.com, and I teach ongoing yoga classes every week of my life. I do ongoing private bodywork sessions, as we've touched on briefly. I have retreats that I lead in Ojai, and I take people up to Esalen, which is Big Sur, is absolutely gorgeous. Um, I'm very fortunate that I get to have the life that I do, and share my passion with people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Excellent. And you also do teacher training, it looks like, as well.
I do. I do. Yes, I have a teacher training called Awakened Heart, Embodied Mind that I do at Exhale in Venice, which is a very well-known yoga studio. And that's teacher training in which I have a co-teacher named Hala Curry, who is a somatic psychologist. And what we do in that teacher training is prepare teachers not only with the foundational principles of yoga postures and sequencing and anatomy and all of that fantastic stuff, but with a foundation in Buddhist meditation and with neuroscience and somatic psychology influenced material, so as to have a more integrated, create, I suppose, a more integrated space and context for yoga practice that allows it to really be beneficial in ways that are up to date with contemporary knowledge.
Excellent. Sounds like a very comprehensive training program.
Yeah, well, we try.
Excellent, excellent. Well, our guest today has been Julian Walker, and the site, again, is julianwalkeryoga.com, and I'll have that linked on the episode page for this episode, as well as a link to his book. And Julian, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Ted. It's been delightful.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.